Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'm glad you're with us this morning, and we are always happy to be able to have these community programs that touch all the various communities in Gainesville, but especially when we partner with the Center for Jewish Studies, the Bud Shorstein Center for Jewish Studies. It is always a pleasure. Today I want to introduce to you Dr. Rachel Gordan. Many of you know her, maybe all of you know her. She received her PhD from Harvard University in North American Religions, her BA from Yale in American Studies, and her Master's in Religion from Yale Divinity School. After receiving her PhD, she held postdoctoral fellowships at Northwestern University, University of Toronto, before teaching at Boston University and Brandeis. As a scholar of American religion, she researches Judaism and Jewish culture from the early 20th century to the present, with particular focus on the immediate post-World War II era, middlebrow culture, and American Jewish literary history. We are also congratulating Rachel on her fellowship for the year 24-25 at Harvard University. And of course, we should mention that she is married to the esteemed Dr. Yaniv Feller, who is here with us today as well. So, without further ado, and much thanks to the Bud Shorstein Center and to Bud Shorstein himself for sponsoring today. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eden Constantine, and Rachel's a colleague of mine. I'm a professor of religious studies, and I'm also a scholar of North American religions at UNC Chapel Hill. And I'm just so happy to be here today to discuss Rachel's exciting new book, Postwar Stories: How Books Made American Judaism. I've prepared just a very brief summary of the book to orient folks who haven't read it yet, and then we'll dedicate the rest of our time to conversation. So, Postwar Stories describes how a variety of Jewish American authors represented and negotiated their identities in the decade following World War II. Importantly, the texts and authors that we meet throughout postwar stories occupied the middlebrow. They were not lofty literary elites, nor were they examples of entirely superficial commercial culture. And it was in this middlebrow, readerly milieu, Rachel argues, that Jews and Judaism transformed from a sort of exotic, racialized minority into an expected and respected part of the US religious landscape. So there are two sort of categories of texts that facilitated this shift. The first Rachel calls the anti-antisemitism novel. So the anti-antisemitism novel was a novel where the characters came to recognize and sort of ultimately reject the anti-Semitism that prevailed in US culture. The second kind of text that we learn about in postwar stories is the introduction to Judaism text. And these included both magazines and magazine articles and books. And so the introduction to Judaism text was a text that provided sort of a brief primer on the basic tenets of Judaism, and that was directed towards Jews and non-Jews alike. And so throughout the book, these two categories of text are plotted semi-chronologically. We start out with the anti-antisemitism novels, which appeared in the late 1940s. And then the introduction to Judaism texts circulated a little later, in the early 1950s. And so as one text sort of shifts into the other throughout the book, we see some really big changes taking place. When the anti-antisemitism novels appeared in the years immediately after World War II, US readers were very eager to differentiate US culture and US political power from the sort of cultures and forms of political power that were salient during World War II. And so the anti-antisemitism novel was a site where readers came to sort of see and despise anti-Semitism, and thus they were able to kind of distance themselves from the fascist regimes and sort of imagine Americans as more tolerant global citizens. Introduction to Judaism texts, which appeared several years later against the backdrop of the Cold War in the early 1950s, sort of used Judaism to make Jews look more American. These texts coded Judaism in a way that Christian readers would have recognized, right? These texts use language like creed, belief, ceremony, to make Jews look like a religion among other religions. And in the Cold War period, having a religion was really important to being American. So this recoding of Judaism as a religion gave Jews sort of a renewed sense of respectability and belonging in the American scene. So at the beginning of post-war stories, in the years immediately following the war, Judaism was narrated as sort of a marker of racial difference, a sort of burdensome inheritance. But by the end of the book, and by the 50s, we see Judaism reimagined as a religion, and thus something that Jews can embrace or reject willingly. So that's sort of the plot of the book. I learned so much from reading this book. I was particularly enjoyed being reminded of the really profound questions that play out in the milieu we might call popular culture, right? We see these sort of paperbacks and magazines as sites of negotiating belonging, negotiating religion and identity. I studied Protestantism in the same period, and I just really loved learning about another perspective on the post-war years, and I spent so much time leafing back through Rachel's footnotes to see how her research came together. And I'm excited to learn even more throughout our conversation today. So my first question for you, Rachel, is I would love to just hear kind of about the biography of the book. How did the study come together? What inspired it? What was the process like?
Thank you, Eden. And I just want to add, speaking of biography, how this came about. Eden and I met actually as a result of a research trip. Scholars are used to discovering great finds in the archive, but while I was doing research at UNC Chapel Hill, and I was hanging out a bit with a friend from grad school who teaches in the religion department at UNC Chapel Hill, he introduced me to one of his colleagues in the religion department, Eden, and we started talking and realized we have this overlapping interest in 1950s religion and popular culture and Life magazine in particular. So it's great to have you here.
I'm so happy.
This book came about, and let's see, Phil, I don't know if we have the PowerPoint up. Oh yes, wonderful. Okay, so this book was inspired by my dissertation, which was originally called How Judaism Became an American Religion. And in that dissertation, I was explaining how, the question I was trying to answer is, how do Jews go from being considered members of a marginalized kind of subhuman race or minority in the beginning of the 20th century? Many of us are familiar with the idea that Jews were considered a race in the beginning decades of the 20th century, sometimes called the Hebrew people or Semitic people. And then in the mid-20th century, we go towards Jews being explained or understood in America as members of a religion. And I was always sort of wondering, how does this transformation come about? And one of the instances of this change being described came from the Harvard sociologist Nathan Glazer. So I just want to actually read a little bit from the book where I talk about this shift in the mid-20th century where we see Judaism becoming an American religion. Several events indicated that the mid-20th century was a time of greater salience for religion in American public life. It was in the 1950s that the phrase, "under God," was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. "In God We Trust" became the national motto in 1956. While the idea of Judeo-Christianity as the antidote to totalitarian regimes gained widespread currency in the 1940s and 50s. Judaism and popular culture played a surprisingly central role in the cultural shifts that made religion prominent after nearly 2 decades of what felt like years of spiritual depression, in addition to economic depression, to many in the Northeast, where much post-war Jewish literature was created. While the aftermath of this mid-century transformation has been explored in scholarly investigations of the Judeo-Christian tradition, there has been far less attention to the way popular culture participated in this change. Historians focusing on post-war American Jews have yet to fully answer the question of how Judaism achieved its post-war status as an American religion. This question is one that already intrigued post-war observers. In the mid-1950s, sociologist Nathan Glazer mused, "It would be an interesting essay in the history of ideas to determine just how the United States evolved in the popular mind from a Christian nation to a nation made up of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews." The most interesting part of such a study, which I do not plan to undertake here, would be to discover how it came about that the Jewish group, which through most of the history of the United States has formed an insignificant percentage of the American people, has come to be granted the status of most favored religion. So Glazer was writing this in his 1957 book, American Judaism, which itself was part of a trio of books that the University of Chicago Press published. One was American Protestantism, one was American Catholicism, and then Glazer authored the American Judaism book. And just the fact of the existence of these 3 books was one of many signs in the 50s that we're in this era of tri-faith America, as historians sometimes call it, or Judeo-Christian America, when suddenly, or it seems rather sudden, to be an American was considered to belong to one of these 3 supposedly American religions, whereas earlier in the 20th century, to be an American was to be a white Christian. So my question then was, how and why does this shift come about? So that was something I looked at in the dissertation. And then when I was transforming that dissertation into a book, I was really thinking about what was I really adding that was new to scholarly conversations about this era, and decided that it was this focus on the cultural work of middlebrow literature. And I think we'll probably get into a little bit of that.
Yeah, great. So the sort of main characters in this book are books. And I was curious as I read if there were any important books or books you were really compelled by, maybe even magazine articles that didn't make it in. Is there anything you had to leave on the cutting room floor that you'd like to tell us about?
Yeah, it's such a fun question. Thanks, Eden. One of the figures that didn't make it in, I just want to mention, is Gertrude Berg. She was in an earlier version of the book. She was kind of almost an Oprah of her day. She had a media empire. She was the creator, writer, and star of this long-running radio show turned television show. So from 1929 all the way to 1955, The Goldbergs was the first Jewish American radio program, incredibly successful. And then she gets William Paley to make it into a television show, which she starred in. So she was the first woman to write, produce, and star in a television show. And there is merch to attach to it. She does a cookbook. There's a Broadway play. And so she is really part of this mid-20th century middlebrow moment in American Jewish culture that I'm describing in the book. She's part of that bigger phenomenon, but because I ended up focusing in the book on just 2 genres, what I call anti-antisemitism novels and introduction to Judaism literature, she had to be cut. But I think she's incredibly important. And the other one I just want to mention, who does get mentioned in the book, is Marjorie Morningstar, the 1955 best-selling novel by Herman Wouk, which then became a film starring Gene Kelly and Natalie Wood as this Jewish couple at the center of the novel. And this too is part of this larger mid-century middlebrow moment in American Jewish culture, doing some of the same kind of work of introducing Judaism as an American religion to audience. When you compare this film from '58 to a film from a generation earlier, The Jazz Singer, the first sound movie from 1927, I think, and you look at the scenes portraying Judaism in The Jazz Singer, they are very immigrant, ethnic, kind of alien, and it seems very othered. And early in this film, there is what is probably the first middle-class portrayal of a bar mitzvah. And all of us who have been at bar mitzvahs it will sound familiar when you see this scene, but it's really portraying Jews in a very middle-class kind of setting, and the fact that Natalie Wood is portraying the female protagonist, and Gene Kelly, who is also a Jew in the film, is her love interest, shows a real shift in how popular culture was portraying Jews. So it's another fun example. I would have liked to have had. It originally was more in the book, and it had to be cut down too.
Well, I hope there'll be future projects about both of these, because that's so fascinating and important. And so you got to this a little bit already in your intro to the book, but I'm curious who your most desired audience for the book is. Are you hoping to speak to mostly academics? Are there academic arguments that you want to sort of turn on their head with this book? Are you interested in audiences beyond the academy? I'd love to hear a little bit more about who you're trying to reach.
I was definitely thinking of audiences beyond the academy, because I've just noticed when I've gotten to give community presentations about my research is that this is close enough in time that many of us were either alive or have parents or grandparents and feel we know something but not everything about this era. And I also remember too, early on in writing the book, talking with colleagues who work in American religion or American studies who are also interested in this era, and it became apparent that they also had this sense that everything seemed to have changed for Jews in America in the immediate post-war years, but not a real understanding of how it all fits together. As I mentioned earlier, many of my academic colleagues have worked on the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is something that we really see emerge in the late 30s and 40s. So there has been some work done on that, as well as what is known as the Tri-Faith America, but not really enough scholarship on what kind of role does popular culture play in this era? What did it help accomplish? And so that's where I saw my contribution in these scholarly conversations.
Awesome. And yeah, it's such a welcome contribution. So I'd love to get into a little bit of like the nitty-gritty of that popular culture. What was the universe around the texts you write about, right? As I read, I was curious, like, who's publishing these texts? Where are they sold? Who's buying them? Are they money makers? I'd love to just hear some of the sort of nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Eden. It lets me read a little bit more about one of my authors who I talk about is Rabbi Milton Steinberg of Manhattan's Park Avenue Synagogue, a very famous mid-century rabbi who wrote a famous novel called As a Driven Leaf. It was still sort of assigned a lot to Hebrew schools and Sunday schools when I was growing up. That book was published in the 30s, but in the 40s, he writes his own introduction to Judaism called Basic Judaism. And his decision to write this primer on American Judaism, explaining Judaism to both Jews and non-Jews, really came about because of his understanding of his congregants, who he realized often didn't know that much about Judaism. Rabbis sometimes probably feel this way too, but he felt they could use some sort of accessible, enjoyable, not too dense material, and also his relationship with his editors who were non-Jews, and it was significant for him, a Jew who grew up in the early 20th century, to hear from a non-Jewish editor that this is interesting, there's an audience for this. So Steinberg's relationships bolstered his confidence that there was a market for books about Jews and Judaism. In 1945, Steinberg's editor at Harcourt Brace, Lambert Davis, a Southerner whose authors included Robert Penn Warren and Eudora Welty, wrote to Steinberg about his proposal for a book about Judaism. Quote, as for the primer on Judaism, Davis wrote to Steinberg in the spring of 1945, the more I think of it, the more I believe it is an extremely sound idea. It is a book that I would want to read myself, even though I've had the best teacher on the subject, Davis wrote, referring to Steinberg and adding, it is a book that ought to be written. Steinberg was buoyed by the encouragement of his non-Jewish editor, who was well positioned to provide reassurance of a wider audience for his writing. But Steinberg wasn't only contemplating his writing for the sake of writing. The struggle to support his family on Manhattan's Upper East Side meant that Steinberg could not afford not to think about finances. Quote, I am sure of its commercial possibilities, Steinberg wrote to Davis of Basic Judaism, explaining that, quote, there never has been a simple, vivid presentation of Jewish beliefs and ideals. A crying need exists for one among and for Jews, and I believe to a lesser extent among non-Jews. Imagining Basic Judaism's future, he elaborated, this is the kind of book that should sell forever. It will be presented as a confirmation gift to settle arguments and as a means of persuasion by Jews who wish to win over other Jews to a positive position on Judaism. Basic Judaism would go through 39 editions between 1947 and 2004, suggesting that Steinberg's predictions were not far off the mark. Steinberg's confidence in the market for his book may have been inspired in part by reactions from his moneyed congregants and readers, such as the Morgenthau family. After Steinberg's book, The Making of the Modern Jew, was published in 1934, a handwritten note arrived from Helen Morgenthau Fox, the sister of the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr. A botanist, Fox was in the process of designing the Metropolitan Museum's Cloisters Herb Gardens when she wrote to Steinberg, quote, it is the kind of book that I am going to give as a present. In her letter, Fox named the men in her life to whom she planned to gift Steinberg's book. Interestingly, while Fox judged Steinberg's book exciting, she also found it, quote, so tragic and anguished, given, quote, present-day conditions and my own history in relation to being a Jewess, that she felt the need to take breaks from reading it, as she recounted to Steinberg. Despite her assessment that the book's somber subject was best suited for male readers, Fox's enthusiasm translated into her desire to promote The Making of the Modern Jew. That was one of Steinberg's earlier books on Judaism. That kind of interest was valuable to authors like Steinberg. Publishers, too, appreciated this word-of-mouth publicity. A 1940s Harper's article about publishing noted that, quote, publishers nowadays are beginning to send the important books on their lists to a growing list of influential readers to start the conversation even before publication. The article continued, everyone in the book trade agrees that one of the most potent factors in book sales is talk among readers. Someone reads a book and likes it and tells a friend about it, the friend decides that he ought to buy it, and the circle expands. Women readers such as Fox served as this kind of helpful advocate of books to which they felt an emotional connection. Fox's letter is also a reminder that while Steinberg was changing Park Avenue Synagogue, indeed the congregation shifted from Reform to conservative under his leadership, Park Avenue Synagogue was also changing Steinberg. He was being introduced to Jews whose affiliation with Judaism was often expressed materially through the purchase of books or Judaic items. That, too, may have affected the value Steinberg placed in his writing. So just getting at as you asked, sort of how did the book circulate, there was this sense of reading it, telling friends, giving it as gifts. That word of mouth among Jews was very helpful for especially the Intro to Judaism books.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things I picked up from the passage you just read is what a refined sense of desired audience the authors and publishers had, right? They seem to have a really clear picture of who this book was for. And so my follow-up question there is about moments of surprise audiences. Are there moments in your research where a book or text sort of reaches a community or a person that it wasn't intended for, and if there's any interesting outcomes there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of probably Milton Steinberg could not have predicted that his book, let's see if I have the right. Okay, so this was from 1959, a Jewish newspaper. Elizabeth Taylor, this was about her conversion process to Judaism. This newspaper article reported that in addition to studying the Bible, Miss Taylor read What is a Jew by Rabbi Morris Kurtzer. That's one of the many Introduction to Judaism books. Basic Judaism by the late Rabbi Milton Steinberg, who died tragically young. What the Jews Believe by Rabbi Philip Bernstein, which is another Introduction to Judaism book that I discuss in here. So it says Miss Taylor is also studying Hebrew and was said to be able to follow the basic prayers at this time. So anyway, these books, these Introduction to Judaism books, became famous as the reading material that converts and famous converts read on their path to Judaism. So that's one of the surprise audiences. I also am thinking of in the anti-antisemitism novels, these books were read by other kind of persecuted groups. So some of my authors do get letters from, Black readers explaining, how they identified with a sort of struggle with anti-Semitism that is described.
That's great. And actually the Elizabeth Taylor example is better than I could have imagined. And it segues really nicely into my next question. So as I read, I was curious about what other media the readers would have been consuming, right? So of course there's this whole strata of middlebrow literature that's the focus of your book, but of course the 40s was a golden era for cinema. The 50s is known as the sort of explosion of TV. And I'm wondering, and you got to this a little bit in the question about folks who didn't make it into the book, but I would love to hear a little bit more about parallel conversations that might be happening in other media. Are there sort of discussions of Jewish identity or religious identity more broadly going on TV, radio, and maybe how do they compare or contrast to the middlebrow literature conversations?
Yeah, so other kinds of middlebrow culture are also doing the work of explaining Jews and Judaism. I realize I've been using the word middlebrow, but I want to explain that this term, middlebrow, came from phrenology, which is this fake science that explained that the size of your skull had something to do with your mental capacity. And this term began in the early 20th century, but it gets revived again at mid-century. There's a famous chart that is published in Harper's and then in Life magazine in 1949. We're looking at it here. It's a little too small to see, but it has all this sort of highbrow, upper middle brow, lower middle brow. I'm going to move in a little closer here. So it's got categories like salads and clothes and furniture. And what else is up there? Causes. So art is a highbrow cause. Planned Parenthood is right below it. That's considered upper middle brow. The wine highbrow is a glass of adequate little red wine, and then a very dry martini is right below that as upper middle brow. So middle brow was in use a lot in the mid-20th century. It's a way of categorizing both culture and consumers of culture. And just want to mention, it's still used today. The magazine New York Magazine, every issue also does this highbrow, lowbrow chart, and it's got despicable and brilliant, sort of with pieces of news and culture from that week. So to get back to the question about what other parallel conversations are going on in other forms of middlebrow, like television. So one of my authors of Introduction to Judaism was the Rabbi Morris Kurtzer, who wrote What is a Jew? He also did a television program in the 50s of his family having a Passover Seder. So that was doing that same work of presenting, explaining, showing Judaism is an American religion. And The Goldbergs, which was a television show into the 50s, also includes some Jewish holiday scene. So it's that same thing of by the 50s, the Goldbergs have actually moved to the suburbs. When it begins as a radio program in 1929, they are living in a tenement in the Bronx. But as a television show, it's a suburban middle-class family, and viewers are then seeing Judaism as, okay, part of a neighborly suburban Jewish life.
Yeah, that chart from the Life magazine is truly a blast from the past. That's really fascinating. And so if these conversations are happening sort of across media, I'm curious what then made the middlebrow print unique, right? Like, why focus there if this is happening, on TV, to some extent in cinema? I'd love to just hear a little bit more.
Yeah, in terms of what made the print form unique, I'm just looking right now at a scene from the film Gentleman's Agreement, which gets a lot of discussion in this book. This was one of these anti-antisemitism novels from 1947, the most famous of this genre, attacking anti-Semitism as un-American. This scene is probably most used, actually your advisor at Princeton, who I know, Judith Weisenfeld, has written a lot about this scene, and a lot of professors use it to teach the mid-century moment, the change we see going on. Because in this scene, Phil, who is a non-Jewish reporter, has just been assigned to write an article about anti-Semitism for the magazine he's now working at in Manhattan. And he's at breakfast the next morning with his son and his mother, and Phil is explaining his kind of not interest in this assignment. It seems like it's going to be boring and a lot of work. He's going to have to read a lot of statistics about anti-Semitism. And his son asks, what is anti-Semitism? And what is a Jew? And this happens early in the novel and the film. And so Phil has to explain, what is a Jew? What is anti-Semitism? And in the novel, we also have this scene, but Hobson is able to go into much more detail. So I'm just going to read a little bit here. After Phil asks, after Tommy, the son, asks his father, what is a Jew? Phil explains, you can be an American and a Catholic, or an American and a Protestant, or an American and a Jew. So that's back to that tri-faith America idea, that being American means you have to belong to one of these three. And in fact, 8 years later, the sociologist Will Herberg writes a really famous book called Protestant Catholic Jew, in which he pretty much makes the same argument, that now in Cold War America, this is what it means to be an American, and if you do not belong to one of those three, you basically don't have a real kind of name or identity in America. So then Phil also says, or you could be French or German or Spanish or any nationality at the same time. You're Catholic or a Protestant or a Jew. So that is the author, Laura Z. Hobson, really underlying the fact that Judaism is a religion. Because see, you could be this religion an American, or you could be this religion, Judaism, and another nationality. And Tom looked perplexed. Look, Tom, Phil says to explain, one thing is your country, like America or France or Germany or Russia, all the countries, the flag is different and the uniform is different, the language is different. And then Tommy jumps in and says, the airplanes are marked different. And Phil says, that's right, but the other thing is religion, if you have any, or your grandfather's religion, like Jewish or Catholic or Protestant religion. That hasn't anything to do with the country or the language or the airplanes, get it? This novel is published a year before Israel becomes a state. But Hobson, at this stage of her life, is pretty not so into Israel. And that's because she is the kind of Jew who really wants other Americans to know that Jews are Americans too. And so she's part of this mid-century effort to really focus on explaining Judaism as a religion so that nobody doubts her bona fides as an American. So this kind of really going over the lessons that these novelists want to impart is so much easier to do in print, and I see this in all of the anti-Semitism novels of the 40s. The authors really spend a lot of time drilling into the reader, and there'll often be multiple of these scenes, particularly the kind that are saying Judaism is a religion, not a race. Sometimes they do it very explicitly, because the 40s are really this moment when there's still a strong kind of racial conception of Jews. And so it makes sense to me that these novelists felt like we have to keep on hammering the idea that no, it's a religion, not a race. And of course, that's mostly because Hitler has delegitimized this racial way of categorizing and thinking about Jews.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So the print sort of allows for a kind of immersion in certain arguments that something like a TV show or a movie can't really accomplish. That's fascinating. And so now that you've brought Laura Z. Hobson up, I want to ask a question about the gender of the authors in your book. So gender's a big theme throughout the book, and you note that the anti-antisemitism novels, like the one you just discussed, were frequently written by women. Whereas the introduction to Judaism texts, the sort of primers, were written by men. And at one point you say that the introduction to Judaism writing is a homosocial space, right? A sort of male space. So I kind of want to know why. Like, how did that come to happen, and what were the results?
Yeah, that was interesting to find. Almost all of the introduction to Judaism books in the 40s and 50s were written by men. And I think this is really, religious authority was something that only men were assumed to have, and maybe especially in a religion like Judaism, where we're still in an era when very few girls have anything that even resembles a bat mitzvah. We're not in an age yet of egalitarian Judaism. And it also turns out that most of the women authors of anti-Semitism novels were actually pretty secular. So there's the irony here of, even though Laura Z. Hobson is explaining Judaism as a religion, she herself is completely secular. It's kind of done out of this pragmatic sense that Jews in Cold War America are going to be most accepted if their fellow Americans understand that they check the box for religion. Even though she herself had grown up in a totally secular home, her father actually helped to found the Jewish Daily Forward. Her mother wrote a woman's column for another Yiddish paper called Der Tog. So she has these real Yiddishist roots. She starts at Hunter College and then transfers to Cornell because she wants this real American experience. And she continues to be a real assimilation success story. She never denies she's Jewish when asked, but like many children of immigrants of that era, the goal was to become 100% American. So her use of religion, I think, is very pragmatic and practical. This is how Jews will be most acceptable. And the authority that women authors could have was in the realm of fiction. They could write about their experience, fictionalize it. To be a female novelist was totally acceptable. But it just wasn't an era when women could write that authoritatively on religion.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and that helps a lot to sort of see how the gender dynamics break down across the texts. And so you've already started to answer this is my second to last question. I just have two more about the big themes of the book. But you've already started to answer this one, which is about that pivot from Judaism as a race to Judaism as a religion, which is really kind of the main argument of the book. And I wondered how intentional that move was. Was this sort of an accident of the way that these Jewish authors were presenting themselves, or was it really a sort of concerted goal to make that switch?
Yeah, it was definitely a real goal, an intentional goal in all of the authors. There's a feeling that America still has a real race problem, unsurprisingly, in the 40s and 50s when they're writing. An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal comes out in 1944, which is about really the problem with blacks and race in America at this time. Anyone who is interested in race understands it as a problem in the culture. And so to explain Jews as a race is to say they're a problem. But to explain them as an American religion is to make them integratable, acceptable. And so that is why we see even these secular Jews, if they want to make the case for why Jews are Americans like other Americans, they have to do so using the language of religion. And then, as we mentioned, it's also the period of the Cold War, when Jews are aware that for many Americans, communism still seems a little synonymous with Jewishness. And so Jews really want to make the point, we are not that kind of Jew. We are the kind that has a good religion. I find even Herbert Hoover in this era, when he was writing about religion, the importance of religion during Cold War America, is explaining that there is a good kind of Jew who is acceptable, that is the religious Jew. So he too wants to make the point, there are Jews who are acceptable, and they are the ones who belong to some religion.
Yeah, that's so interesting right there. It was just crucial to not be that kind of atheistic, communist-looking figure, right? Fascinating. And so this is my last question, which is sort of a big question I had as I finished the book. One of the observations you make that I think is so interesting that really stuck with me is this concept of Judaism as a choice, right? So by the end of the book, there's this notion circulating that you can either sort of accept your Judaism and embrace it and make it a big part of your identity, or you can sort of hide it under the rug, but both options are available to Jewish people, whereas previously, earlier in the 20th century, this was a marker you were stuck with, right? And so this concept of Judaism as a choice got me thinking about Protestantism, right? So the sort of thing of Protestantism is that you choose this, you accept this, right? You make this born-again experience. And so I wondered if this pivot towards Judaism being less racialized, Judaism being more of a choice, is ultimately an assimilation towards the sort of Protestant backdrop. And I'm curious if you're telling a story of assimilation, or if you're hoping for us to see some sort of more subtle dynamics going on, something that maybe the term assimilation can't capture. What do you think?
That's a great question. It's one that a lot of people asked me while I was working on this and telling people about the research. I feel like many of them said, is this a story about the Protestantization of Judaism, or at least the Americanization of Judaism? I think there is some of that desire to fit in that was really in the air, again, because of the Cold War pressure to not stick out too much. So I see that in both sets of authors, but I also saw a surprising amount of willingness to show the particularities of Judaism among the rabbis writing in the 50s. And even though we're used to thinking of the 60s as the decades when it's sort of, back to roots, showing your ethnic particularity. Fiddler on the Roof is really popular in 1964, and there we're looking at our European, Jewish immigrants, and the 1967 war brings out this pride in Israel. So that's sort of part of what makes Jews different too. I think we see some traces of that pride and Jewish difference in the 50s, and in my chapters where I talk about introduction to Judaism books, I do explain how authors were willing to show how Judaism is not a total parallel. There are some things that Protestants will find weird and different, but Jews are able to explain that with dignity. Which reminds me, when we look at any of these introduction to Judaism books today from the 40s and 50s, they often appear pretty banal, or like, what's the big deal? It's just explaining Judaism. It's hard to understand how remarkable they seemed in the 40s and 50s, just because there were so few English language books about Judaism that anyone could understand that were explaining Jewish religion with dignity. What was known as a Jewish book for much of the first half of the 20th century was often something in Yiddish or Hebrew. There just wasn't enough being published yet. And the fact that these introduction to Judaism books become popular in the 40s and 50s is evidence of this new interest that publishers and editors realize there is now an audience for this that there wasn't in the very nativist, xenophobic 20s and 30s.
Yeah, that's awesome. I've had such a joy asking you all the questions I had about the book. And so now I think we should turn it over to the audience. What questions are lingering for you all?
Or comments or insights.
Yeah.
In Gentleman's Agreement, there is a discussion of Jewish war veterans. And during World War II, Jews were fully integrated into the U.S. Armed Forces, where blacks and Asians were not. In your research, how much of a role did that play in the literature that came out, both in terms of the authors and the subject Americanize the Jewish experience?
Great question about Jews being involved in the war effort, serving. What role did that play in these sort of explanations of Judaism and the anti-antisemitism? One of my colleagues in American Jewish Studies, Deborah Dashmore, wrote a great book, G.I. Jews, which is about this Jewish experience in the war. So that felt very covered, but you're right that many of the rabbis who were authors of Introduction to Judaism had been chaplains, had served in the war, so they saw what was happening among Jewish soldiers. And part of what was happening is that Jews, some of them coming from either kind of secular homes or homes where they felt sort of embarrassed or not that into their Jewishness, were in a setting where everyone expected them to celebrate Passover, or there was a Seder being provided for Jewish soldiers, and so the non-Jewish soldiers would say, "Oh, aren't you going to that Seder that we see being set up?" And there was a sense of, oh, the government has some respect for my religion. They are providing the sort of infrastructure for it. There's respect and space for it in the U.S. Armed Services. That does a lot to give a lot of Jewish men this sense of, this is a part of my American identity. Non-Jews have some understanding of how it fits into the category of religion. So in multiple ways, that war experience did a lot for making the space for Judaism as a religion and showing non-Jews, oh, this is what a Jew is. He fights alongside of you. He is like you in many ways, and he has a religion.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, David.
Just going back to those catalysts of change in the post-war years for Jews in America, can you talk to me specifically about the formation of the state of Israel had on the legitimacy and dignity that Jews had in America? And maybe there's something the governmental acceptance that trickles through culturally.
Yeah, it's in 1948, many of my authors of Introduction to Judaism are writing their books. There are brief sections on Israel. I'm also thinking of actually this example of an Introduction to Judaism text that I talk about in the book. This was a 1955 special issue about Judaism that appeared in Life. So we have this Orthodox Jewish woman on the cover of Life. Her name is Toby Fink. And this article profiled her family, but it also profiled Israeli Jews. And it appeared 5 years after an earlier Life article on Judaism, which had been written by a Reform rabbi and was pretty bland. By the time we get to this 1955 special issue, Henry Luce, the publisher of Time Incorporated, he's in touch with his other editors at Time and saying, we need something more colorful and interesting. And he says specifically that we'll find that in the Orthodox Jews and the Israeli Jews. So there is a feeling, pride, although I think probably the 60s get more of that pride jump, but also sense that there's something vibrant and colorful that makes us Jews stand out in this kind of really joyous, lively way, because people, see in magazines like Life pictures of young people in Israel building a state, Israeli dancing, all of that. It's clear, especially so soon after the Holocaust, that there is joy and life and youth. And so I do see that thanks to photojournalism and television. I think those images are part of what bring the respect to Jews. I'd have to say that a lot of my authors don't spend a ton of time in Israel, and I think it is part of that 40s and 50s desire to not detract attention away from we are Americans first. That's what many of these Jews feel. So it gets a sort of small treatment during this era.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ollie.
Thank you so much, Rachel. My question is about the genre. If someone is reading an introductory book versus a novel, what kind of a message is conveyed through these two genres? Is it similar? Is there more focus on ritual and belief and creed, so to speak, as you said, in the introductory, and more focus on novel or culture. So what's the qualitative difference in the image of Judaism being portrayed in these two genres?
Thanks for that question, Ali. Yes, I spend a good amount of time in the book describing the genres, but as you suggested, the anti-Semitism novels do a lot to help a reader identify with a character, and I describe it as the novels providing a kind of confessional, because we see our characters sort of confiding some of maybe their doubts about Jews or their anti-Semitism, and then we see their like inner monologues evolve to moving towards anti-Semitism, which is a term that we actually find in the 40s. It sounds clunky and weird to us today, but it was used in the 40s, and I find it so apt because the 40s weren't yet a period when Americans were in love with Jews and Judaism. We know that in part because intermarriage rates were still quite low, but it was this time when Americans were sort of defining themselves in contrast to European enemies and saying, well, if they, our enemies, hate Jews, well, then part of what it's going to mean to be a good liberal American is that we are at least opposed to anti-Semitism. So it's a sort of baby step, this anti-Semitism. So to get back to your question, the novels provide that identification with non-Jewish characters who are learning attitudes of anti-Semitism, and mostly they don't provide too much of the Jewish religion or ritual. In fact, Hobson, what Laura Z. Hobson, who wrote Gentleman's Agreement, was really critiqued because people said, you finish this novel or this film with no more idea of Judaism than when you started, because she so avoided really showing the particularities of Judaism. That was in fact part of her strategy because she's focusing on her non-Jewish protagonist. So for her that was a strength because she thought, well, I'll get more Americans to identify by having my protagonist be this non-Jew who learns to become a kind of white Christian savior who wants to fight anti-Semitism. And I think it was an effective strategy. But rabbis often critiqued the novel and sort of felt like, what a wasted opportunity. Your book was so popular, bestseller, made into this Academy Award-winning film starring Gregory Peck, and you didn't do anything to explain Judaism, the riches of this heritage and religion. So a lot of the novels don't get into the religion, and in some ways that's the connection to the introduction to Judaism literature, because rabbis were sometimes explicitly saying, those novels didn't show you what this religion is about. I want to show you that there's a lot of good in here, and they were, taking the next step of actually explaining Judaism then. Yeah, Linda.
I couldn't help but think while I was listening to you and then just glancing at the book. This was published beginning of 2024. It went to press, I guess, within the last 6 to 10 months or so. What has crossed through your mind, given what has gone on in the world and the rising anti-Semitism? And there are obviously books that have not yet been published about this time, and I can't help but wonder if there's going to be a potential part 2, since we seem to be circling back to a lot of things from the 30s and 40s.
That's such an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking a little bit of the article Buddy sent me, and I know many of you read from The Atlantic by Franklin Foer about the golden age of American Jews being over. And it's a recent article in The Atlantic, kind of sort of saying, how did we get to where we are now, and how has so much changed, where we've seen so much more anti-Semitism, and he's really focused on the college campus situation. I guess, my reaction to that current feeling of, how did we get to what feels like so much more, what is so much more anti-Semitism and a more uncomfortable experience, especially on certain campuses, is that the era I'm talking about was this era of increased popularity. We saw that in that first quotation that I showed from Nathan Glazer, the Harvard sociologist, where he's saying, how did Jews suddenly become the most favored religion? That might sound strange to us today in 2024. I don't think we're back to the 20s and 30s era, which is the era I begin with in the book, in part because, as I explain in Postwar Stories, we are still, fortunately, used to talking about anti-Semitic incidents, isolated events, the most deadly being the 2018 shooting at the Pittsburgh Tree of Life Synagogue. So those events still stick out to us. The environment I'm describing in the 20s and 30s is one of what I call ambient anti-Semitism. It was just all around, the air you breathed, and it really defined and limited young Jews' sense of possibility. So if I were growing up in the 20s and 30s, it would have meant where I thought I could go to school, who would be friends with me, who would date me, what clubs would accept me, what camps I could go to. It was so pervasive that it was, not just accepted, but expected. And I'm glad to know that we're still at least outraged by these. They still kind of shock us. Whereas, as you and I were discussing before, I was surprised in the archive how hard it was to find comment on anti-Semitism by Jews. They didn't they couldn't isolate it almost because it was everything. Whereas today, fortunately, it does still stand out. Yeah.
All of these Jewish authors from that mid-century. And I'm actually the product of that because that whole generation where suddenly Jews became sort of mainstream probably allowed my parents to marry. It was, my father was from WASP background, my mother was from New York Jews, and they met in Boston, and as he got to know her, they bought all of those books. The basic Judaism books so they could get married, but also all of the other books that explored, Jews in fiction.
That's such a great story. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that really that was the goal. Just wanted to bring up, since you mentioned, these were a few in this genre, the Morris Kurtzer, the Introduction to Judaism, This Is My God by Herman Wouk. Milton Steinberg, who wrote Basic Judaism, was actually cousins with the author of What the Jews Believe, which was written by Philip Bernstein, a Reform rabbi from Rochester. And so this is part of that homosocial world of male rabbis mostly who often had connections to each other. Yeah.
How does the Holocaust reflect in the new adjustment to how a Jew is felt, is visualized?
A good question about Holocaust's influence. I think some of it is that the Introduction to Judaism genre is a bit in reaction to this sense that everyone sees us as victims, as weak, as hunted down, and these Introduction to Judaism books is an effort to show we have a living, robust faith. That phrase, living faith, is one that I found a lot in my research and stood out to me because we don't use it as much anymore. But even when Reform Judaism was switching its headquarters to Manhattan in the early 50s, they have a building on Fifth Avenue, I think that it was called the House of Living Judaism. So that living adjective is used a ton in the 50s, and I really see it as a kind of response to the Holocaust. We are still here, our religion is still alive. Some of it came from the fact that non-Jews in the 40s and 50s, we're still in an era when many Americans had never met a Jew. Since we live in the South, we might have met some of those non-Jews too. And they, even educated ones, would sometimes ask Jews, do you still sacrifice? Basically showing they base their understanding of Judaism on the Hebrew Bible. And so this idea of Judaism as a living faith was also a response to that idea that Judaism was obsolete, or that it was what the Old Testament described it to be. The other answer I wanted to give to your question about how the Holocaust is affecting images of Jews is that these books are also coming out at a time when many Americans, especially in urban centers, are coming across or seeing survivors, especially ultra-Orthodox Jews, Jews who are visibly Jewish and religious with the black garb and the beards. And so I do find a few of my authors describing that scene of, say, walking down the modern streets of Manhattan and coming across these survivors who so look like they come from another world. And the mix of emotions they feel, they're often really describing a sort of embarrassment, a feeling of, I don't want to be associated with you. You look like you come from, almost another planet. And then also the shame at realizing that is what I feel about these Jews who are clearly survivors, or at least resemble the idea of what many of us have. So the kind of reckoning with, or dealing with, how do we incorporate these Jews who look very other to us, we assimilated American Jews, is something that I see already being addressed in this literature.
Yeah, I think there was a question.
Yeah.
I was a little confused by the last author that you showed us. I'm sorry, I haven't read the book yet. So, but not this one, but the last, the phrase, the part that you read, where she's talking about Judaism as one of the three American religions. That's when Jews, Holocaust survivors, are not allowed in the country. We still have, we still, only the most elite Jews can get in. Otherwise, everybody is blocked.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a time when many survivors are waiting. Right. I mean, my grandparents, I guess, were waiting then in a displaced persons camp, and they would right. Yeah.
They were waiting. They were supposed to go to Israel because we didn't want them. I mean, Americans didn't want them. And maybe that included Jews.
Yeah, I mean, it is the case that I think Hobson, the author of this novel, was. She was, not really thinking about the survivors and the European Jews. This is a strongly assimilationist novel, so she's arguing for acceptance of Jews who look like other Americans, and that's very explicit in the novel. So, I don't think it would be too much to say that she was not really advocating for the survivors who weren't going to make an effort to really Americanize. So it is still an era of that kind of exclusiveness and Jews who think they're widening the circle of tolerance, but actually have real limits on what kind of Jew is eligible. Yes.
Actually, I was going to ask about the impact of survivors who emigrated to the U.S., which includes my whole family. But they were not, visibly Orthodox or Haredi, but they had accents, because they came from Poland or Germany or elsewhere. So does that appear in the literature that you've looked at? That they're not, they're visibly secular, but they they're clearly European in their language and have some other behaviors.
Yeah, there is it reminds me of, in Gentleman's Agreement, there is a scientist who seems to be based on Albert Einstein, where he seems a little European. And it does feel to me that he is acceptable because he's exceptional, which is an idea that we see even before this era. The Yehudi Menuhins, the Albert Einsteins, the Louis Brandeises. If you were so special, that was another way you gained a certain kind of acceptance, but in a way you weren't just like other Americans because you were so special. Your question also makes me think of the Goldbergs. It always surprised me how Gertrude Berg did the real kind of accent in that both the radio and the television show, even though she herself did not, she was a child of immigrants, but she didn't have an accent. But I think she was, in that show, as a way to communicate a kind of hamishness that did evoke sort of good feelings among American listeners, even though it was European or other. It showed this positive side of how these European Jews had good family life. So I don't see it in most of this 1940s and 50s literature, but it does sort of pop up at times, and I think it really is because the idea is still you should try to be a real American. Yeah.
I'm sorry I was not here when the presentation. You just mentioned in the 40s. I have read recently in Yiddish from Europe, from I forget the name of the town, to New York. This is describing a Jewish girl. I don't know if you tackled this in your reading of this material, who is finding her life in New York. And everything is in Yiddish because everything is done with Jews. There are very few non-Jews. The only non-Jews are the Schwarze. And she mentioned them. So what do you think of it?
It would make sense if there was more Yiddish in especially the novels, because those were trying to portray sort of more realistic life. And if you were showing Jews in the 40s, it would have been not uncommon, especially because so many are set in New York, that at least someone would know someone who's speaking Jewish. But in my research, I don't find much in Yiddish because I am looking at middlebrow literature that is aimed at this broad American readership and audience. So that's sort of the pride in Yiddish, comes later, even beginning in the 50s, because there's a sense that Yiddish has something to do with Jewish humor, which we're seeing in all those very popular Jewish comedians on TV in the 50s. But the 60s even more so. I think the Yiddish is mostly absent in this more popular American Jewish culture. I know we've been here for over an hour, so I think it might be time to enjoy some of Ipti's delicious food. But thank you for joining me in celebrating this book.